And thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House, and I'm very pleased to welcome Polina Barskova and Susan Larsen for tonight's discussion as part of the programme for the Pushkin House Book Prize, of which Polina is a member of the jury this year. I'll just say a few words about Polina and Susan and then we can get started. Polina Barskova is a scholar and a poet, and the author of 13 collections of poems and 3 books of prose in Russian. Her collection of creative non-fiction, Living Pictures, which weaves together memoir, archival material and fiction to explore the legacies of the Siege of Leningrad, received the Andrei Bely Prize in 2015. She has 4 collections of poetry published in English translation, including Air Raid, and she edited the poetry anthology Written in the Dark, 5 Poets in the Siege of Leningrad. Polina has also authored a monograph, Besieged Leningrad, Aesthetic Responses to Urban Disaster, as well as multiple edited volumes on the culture and literature of Besieged Leningrad. And we're delighted to have Polina on the panel of judges for this year's Pushkin House Book Prize. Dr Susan Larsen is a teaching associate in Slavonic Studies at the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Her research explores issues of gender and national identity in Russian culture from the late 18th century to the present. Susan's publications include articles on contemporary Russian cinema, pulp fiction for adolescents, Soviet women's magazines, as well as several translations of Russian play and film scripts. And she's currently working on a cultural history of girlhood in Russia from 1764 to 1917. So thank you, both of you, for being here with us tonight, and thank you, everyone, for coming, and we hope you enjoyed the talk.
First of all, I'd like to thank Pushkin House for giving me the chance to talk to one of my favorite poets and scholars, and I just want to emphasize how incredibly deep Polina's knowledge of this subject, the cultural memory of Leningrad, is, with not only scholarly works and her own creative fiction responding to it, but also a really active program of publishing anthologies of work in English and in Russian, so that people will begin to read more of it. And we'll be talking about one of those anthologies tonight, Written in the Dark. But before we begin, Polina thought that she would commence with a couple of her own poems responding to her research about the siege. So, Polina.
Good evening. Wonderful to see you all here. In difference to, for example, yesterday's event, when we had wonderful Ben Nathans talking about his book, huge and beautiful and very ostensible. My books, my volumes are slim, which is very much in accordance with my will. I think that books should be big enough to live in somebody's pocket. I'm here kind of with Tom Sawyer's idea that books should be somewhat of an apple, and always should be very movable in a way. But for that very reason, since this whole project of my last 15 years lives in many colorful books, some of which you might see here, I thought it makes sense to introduce our conversation, its subject, its method, with a couple of texts. And I have a somewhat slightly impossible question to ask. Sorry if I might put somebody on the spot. Are there people in this audience who do not understand Russian language? Yes. Wow. Wow. This is cool. Then I will read poems and translations. Translations are rather astounding. They are made by an amazing creature, Belarusian poet Valzhina Mort. Um, they are very lively and difficult and spectacularly unfaithful sometimes. And this is how we wanted them to some extent. It was a rather polyamorous project. So if you notice some striking differences, this is how it was planned. I will give you two texts from a cycle which I see as one of the best examples of the problem that we have here of being professor / poet, which on some level is an oxymoronic situation. And we'll take it from there. The cycle is called A Guide to Leningrad Writers, 1941-1945. And each of these texts, it has a title. I don't give full names of these people, only initials, for a rather kind of difficult reason. So my intention was to intrigue, to provoke, to confuse, maybe sometimes in a slight extent to, I don't know, to offend into questioning. The first poem is called LP, Presence. Наша Маша с ума сошла. Суровый Хармс вино пригубил. 10 января, Пороша, Параша. Украли карточки. Думаю, сам обронил, сам себя пригубил. Если бы не Маршак. Лежишь на полу, рядом сладкой кишки крошка. Лежишь на полу, рядом сладкая крошка дорит. Все помыкаются, поприсмыкаются. Конец будет делу венец. Желудок жалобно подчиняется Диккенсу. Ворчит, мурлыкает, блазнит, вздорит. Живет магической инфернальной жизнью. Как в горе мерцающий кладенец. Как в горе в самом нутре рождаются 2-3 слова, но ни просьбы, ни жалобы, ни угрозы. Вылазят, выползают неудержимо, словно ночь из сердцевины дня. Ты создал меня такого. Ты создал меня сякого. Только тебе доверяю. Смотреть меня, держать меня, свежевать меня. LP. Presence. Our Masha, brain mashed. Hush Harms kissed his wine. January 10th. Snow cap, shit can. Ration cards missing, ration cards missing. Must have dropped them myself. Killed myself goodbye. If not for Marshak. As you stretch on the floor next to bits of sweet guts. as you stretch on the floor next to sweet little Dorrit. Everybody twists, sucks up, ends well. Mournfully, a stomach surrenders to Dickens, grumbles, purrs, lasts, squabbles, lives an enchanted infernal life, like a fairy sword inside a stone, like inside the starved, the curved, pain, 2-3 words are birthed, words not of request, not of complaint, not of threat. They crawl out, unstoppable, like night, straight from the day's heart. Thou hast made me in thy image. Thou, you've made me imagine that. Only thou I trust. To treat who you've made in your image. To trap who you've made in your image. To skin who you've made in your image. And the next one is about somebody called O.B. Ангел, но не голубой, алый, комсомолка Лили Марлен с пуритански закушенной нижней губой, с небывалой плотской ясностью скул. Во всем тебе удача. Только разве вот незадача, НКВДшник выбивает из-под тебя стул, жирная лужа. НКВДшник выбивает из-под тебя, из тебя дитя. Но и от этого тремола энтузиазма практически не убывает. 15 января. Жирный ледяной туман, стужа. Ты оставляешь в больнице юного нежеланного мужа умирать и, запыхаясь, пыхтя, тащишься на улицу Ракова мимо янтарных трупов и бирюзовых трупов. Ах, какой художник все это рисовал. Твой новейший миллионочек спрашивает, где ты была? Что бы об этом сказал Барков? Что бы на это ответил Зубов? Ну что ты такая? Ну что это на тебе? Какой бессмысленный машер и искусительный карнавал. Выпуская ледяное, яркое жало, ты лобызаешь его, ты погружаешься в микрофон, отстраняя сомнения. Не слишком ли быстро сюда бежала? Покуда там от, покуда там до ходил он. Нормально. Нормально, не слишком быстро. Твой высоконький голос проникает туда, куда другое ничто. Сестры, братья мои, дочки матери, я восхищаюсь вами, насыщаюсь вами, утешаюсь вами, падая, 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 беспокоясь. Что это на тебе? Пальто Молчанова. А что у нас под пальто? ОБ. Voice. Angel. Not blue angle, but Russia red Young communist Lili Marlene, with lower lip girlishly beat and unprecedented clarity of cheekbones. Her luck was good luck, sometimes tough luck. NKVD man knocks a chair from under you, a slope of grease. NKVD man knocks a child out of you, which doesn't stop your enthusiastic thrash. January 15th, fog of grease, fog of bitter ice. You leave a young unwanted husband in the hospital to die, and breathing heavily, you drag yourself to the radio bureau. By the corpses in amber, by the corpses in turquoise, about whom you write in your diary. What artist colored them? What an eye! Your new guy inquires. Where you've been? What would Barkov say about this? What would Zubov say about this? What's wrong with you anyway? What's that on you? Darling, what a strange, triggering drag. Your sting of ice hardens. You drill a kiss into him, onto him. You bury yourself into a microphone. You suppress doubts. Your doubts are, didn't you run here in one breath? Well, there he was breathing his last. No, you didn't. Your high-pitched voice penetrates where no other nothing. Sisters, brothers of mine, you say. Mothers, daughters of mine, you say. I worship you, I watch you, I chirp as I fall and fuss. And then he asks, what's that on you anyway? Your husband's coat. And what do we have under this coat? My little one. So I read this to open this door. And one book that is not here, but that was mentioned by Rachel. It's my scholarly monograph called Petersburg Besieged, for which I was endlessly writing introduction, and my editor endlessly was sending them back. And at some point I decided that maybe I shouldn't try to write a normal clarifying text, but somehow I decided to write about my favorite cultural attempt to think about the siege, which is 5 minutes in the film by Alexander Sakurov, Russian Ark, where it all happens, of course, in the Hermitage. Where else? And at some point, they approach a scary door. And one of the protagonists says, don't go there. We just don't go to that door. And that door is the door into the siege and its mythology, with endless layerings and things that one might learn behind the door. And I think these two texts, with everything that one might want to understand, might want to misunderstand. The first text is about Leonid Panteleev, whom every Soviet once a child knows because he was a rather important Soviet writer for children, the author of the unforgettable text Chestное Слово, the honest word, translating it literally. while in his free time, when he wasn't a good Soviet writer, he was many things. He was a friend of Harms and many other remarkable people. And also he was an incredibly curious philosopher of Christianity. And as it was with many of my protagonists, he did it in secrecy and privacy. And basically after his death, the manuscript was found. And another text of his that is still not published and it's full, it's his siege notes, siege diary, where among the other things, and I'm really thrilled to say this, in London, he writes, as many of people who survived or didn't survive the siege, survivor is a very interesting term for me. They write about their relationship with Dickens. It was one of directions of my research, one of the most important for me personally. I studied what they read that winter. Some of the answers were incredible and surprising for me, and I'm happy to talk about this. But one of the writers whom you see mentioned in the diaries a lot was Charles Dickens. And Panteleev writes about it also. The second person, as some of you, I suspect, might have recognized, is Bergholz. Perhaps the most famous and infamous figure of the siege, fascinating, absolutely fascinating and important. Also with many, many layerings that one uncovers about her fate, about her work, about her choices, that begin glimmering and lurking when one studies that world and that material. So this was some kind of introduction before the actual conversation.
So I thought we might, let me know if you can't hear. I thought we might start by talking about some of the writings of the poets who weren't published during the siege or even indeed in their lifetime. The 5 poets whose works are translated and written in the dark, with a wonderful introduction by Polina in bilingual version, so you can read the Russian and look at the English if you're learning Russian. And I just wanted to start, Polina, by asking you how you've discovered them, because it's my impression that it was a gradual discovery as you began looking into archives and finding materials that hadn't been published in most cases until after you began reading them.
So Susan is talking about this volume, книжечка, called Written in the Dark, of which I'm weirdly proud, and I'm at ease with saying this. It's not my poems, and also it's not only my work. If maybe it's the most teamwork that happened in my life so far. Not only it's collection of 5 people, Геннадий Гор, Дмитрий Максимов, Сергей Рудаков, Владимир Стерлигов, and Pavel Zaltzman. But translation was a curious project. Texts were translated by then students of mine and then edited with the help of, I think, leading translators of Russian poetry now, the younger generation. So it's a curious thing. At some point of digging the archival materials and also interviewing people who were in the city. And I came to the city to interview them in 2009, which is very important, because I was able, extremely lucky, privileged, whatnot, to interview people who were there in their 90s. This generation is not on Earth anymore. And these were some of the most exciting relationships and conversations of my life. And as a result of these conversations and networks and archival research, it became clear that there was a kind of writing, kind of poetry in this case, that was curiously invisible, that remained curiously invisible. First of all, it remained curiously invisible because it was written not to be published. And I will briefly introduce one of them to you, given our time limitations, and explain through him. I will try to explain through him, using him as a prism, difficulty of the case. The poet through whom I usually explain this phenomenon, явление, his name is Gennady Gor. His real name was Gdali Gor. He was Jewish. He wrote these poems during the winter of 1941-42, and then slightly when he was evacuated. And then he never read one of these texts, never to anybody. Though he mentioned several times that this notebook exists. To make this story more interesting, Gennady Gor is a rather well-known figure. He made a rather prolific Soviet career by being a Soviet sci-fi writer. I find his sci-fi writing to be ideally boring. There are some wonderful people who tend to disagree, but it is this kind of Soviet sci-fi about virtues of the big Soviet idea and various practicalities of bringing this idea to other planets. Things like this. So this is the person. He had other interests. He was a passionate art collector. As all of them, his career started during the 1930s. And as some of you might know, the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s was an incredible moment in Leningrad. When people ask me what my dissertation at Berkeley was about, I just, to cut the chase, I explained that the dissertation was about 1926 in Leningrad, which was some form of annus miraculous. When you just think that there in the beer bars and ice creameries at Nevsky, there sat these people, being Harms, Shostakovich, Kozintsev, Akhmatova is sitting there smoking somewhere, displeased with somebody. Filonov is looking at the Neva River, things like this. Just density of the situation is somewhat obscene. Soon they will be all punished for who they were variously. Gor belongs to a slightly younger generation. He, as all of these people, for the duration of his life, thought of himself as a creatura, disciple. None of this is exact, precise of Harms. They are post-Harms people. What is even more interesting that some of them began writing when they heard about Harms's death. As some of you again might know, Harms died. If we can think of a life of an artist, symbolic life and death of an artist connected to the siege, I think Harms would be a nice mascot for this hell. So I will read you a couple of these texts. It is also incredibly cute that as most of the people of the male population of Leningrad at the moment, Gor was infatuated with Bergold. And sometimes when I have an hour to explain the cultural horizon of the Siege Leningrad poetry, I just talk about Bergold and Gor. Bergold says perhaps the most heard and published and publishable siege author because of her amazing radio career. And Gor that was heard by virtually nobody during his lifetime. And if you know anything about Leningrad or siege or actually Soviet ideology, you know some of Bergold's poetry. Her poetry is engraved in gold at the siege cemetery, at Piskaryovskaya cemetery. Nobody is forgotten, nothing is forgotten. And again, I'm a huge fan of Bergold, more and more as time crawls and flies, but I have to say that there are things to question about this phrase. The bracket that we give to the number of deaths during the siege is 1 million. When we have to explain how many people died there, we usually say from 600,000, which is the number named in Nuremberg. Now we think it's more or less 1.5 million. So there are maybe problems with what Bergold said, though of course she meant something endlessly more subtle and symbolic, I guess. So next to this idea of total, ideal and sublime memory and heroism of memory, we have this kind of writing. I'll read 2 poems. The Uneasy Smile of Edgar Allan Poe. The Ungainly Gait of Cervantes. The Unneeded but Golden Fish. The Unsettling Dangerous Find. They will kill me, I know, one Monday, and fling me right here by the washstand. And my killer will stand washing and marveling where it is for kissing, and stand smiling while he washes. I think of these 2 poems sometimes as his Poe diptych. I ate Rebecca, the girl full of laughter. A raven looked down at my hideous dinner. A raven looked down at me like at boredom, at how slowly this human was eating that human. A raven looked down, but it was for nothing. I didn't throw it, that arm of Rebecca. Я девушку съел хохотунью Ревекку, и ворон глядел на обед мой ужасный, и ворон глядел на меня, как на скуку, как медленно ел человек человека. И ворон глядел, но напрасно. Не бросил ему я Ревеккину руку. Written in Leningrad in 1942.
Thanks. So, thank you for reading that. I discovered Gore through your through this anthology and through talks that you've given and essays that you've written about him. Could you talk a little bit about how this work has been read in Russia now that you've begun to publish it, and or that and others have begun to read it, not only you, but I think of you as the person who kind of led this charge to publish many of these authors, and how is it relevant to our current moment? Are we thinking of these voices and this point in time as history that we need to recover and recall, or is there a way of reading them as relevant to the times that we're living through now?
Thank you. These are at least two questions, and this is how I'll proceed. Poetry by Gore and by his peers in this volume really upset many people in Leningrad. Actually, when Gore's grandchildren found this notebook, and which happened at the end of the 1980s, Gore lived a very long life, died in the psychiatric asylum, like Shalamov. I think about this a lot, somehow. But unlike Shalamov, he died of depression. And when his grandchildren found this notebook and began trying to publish it, and they showed it to some well-respected in the city judges of literary taste, these people were very upset and disappointed, and recommended that this should be just kind of put aside as writing of a perhaps mentally ill person tortured by the siege. But grandchildren didn't take this advice and continued showing these poems until the moment when these poems met a remarkable translator, Piotr Urban, German. And this is how Gore's mystery really came out. So sometimes, and I am asked these questions a lot about my kind of hybrid situation, not in terms of poet professor, but Russian and American. I think there are such curious connections that Gore returned to his city and his readers thanks to the Western reader and to the German reader. I received it that for me it was much easier to read these poems to Americans than to my Leningrad, Petersburg audiences, for a number of reasons. And the main one, two reasons, that many of the people in the States to whom I read this were prepared for this kind of poetry. They read Celan, they read accounts from the ghettos. We all have taboos. I'm not in a position to idealize any society per se, but there are conferences in the West which we attend where people speak about what was happening during that war. Again, when we're talking ghettos, black market, privilege, prostitution, criminality, things like this. To begin speaking about this in Leningrad, Petersburg was incredibly difficult because for decades this kind of memory was conditioned, and this is where the second question that you asked me is becoming relevant. What we're witnessing now, what is happening now, as you all know if you're in this room, is that Russia's government is creating an ideology according to which what is happening now, last night, in Kiev, every night, is connected in curious and completely perverse ways to what happened in 1941. And there is continuity of narrative, which we call Soviet memory of war, where this text about the girl of laughter, Rebecca, is this totally poisonous bubble that does something like acid. It burns through it. And when I began studying this, and why I began studying this, and while I was studying this, I thought about it absolutely as the project about the past. For me, the pathos, I'm not sure that scholarly work should have pathos. This is maybe the whole poet historian thing becomes relevant. For me, the meaning of this was to try to look into the past and to find there people, and some of them are now forever in the present tense, absolutely mesmerizing and cool and difficult and all that. But somehow, while all this was happening, while I was doing my research and my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues, were doing their siege research, it turned out that actually we were working on something weirdly connected to the present. And again, if you want me to talk more about this, ask me questions, I will try to formulate. It's not that simple. It's nothing but simple.
Okay, I would say you can say that again, but we don't have time for you to say that again. It's not that simple. But that brings us into the present, and I think we'll switch now to talking about living pictures, or sort of move towards talking about living pictures, which has recently been published in English in a wonderful translation by Catherine Sapella, both by Pushkin House here in the, Pushkin House, Pushkin Press here in the UK, and in the US by the New York Review of Books, and we have copies of both editions here. Polina, I have so many questions to ask you about this, but I thought we might start from where you left off, talking about the relevance of these writers for the present, and how, in some sense, you're writing in living pictures, as I think I have understood it. You're writing about, you're bringing the voices of the memoirists and the poets, the diarists, into a present tense, and at the same time, they're speaking, you're speaking. It is an odd kind of ventriloquism, trevevishatostvo, to use a word that you used in your speech accepting the Pushkin Prize. So the Pushkin Prize, sorry, the Andrei Bely Prize. You're on the Pushkin Prize jury. The Andrei Bely Prize in 2015, you said you needed to master the art of ventriloquism, which quite literally is speaking from the belly, where I think one of your interlocutors kept Dickens, yes, in the poem that you just read, but speaking from the belly, ventriloquism, in different languages. Why? Why and how did you go about it? And what are the risks of attempting that kind of ventriloquism in your own creative work?
I like to think that actually I don't speak for them. I speak about them and with them. Living pictures, which is tableau vivant, right? The parlor game about which we can read in many novels and memoirs. So this is the game. People are bored, slightly tipsy. They think of a work of visual art that they would like to, which verb should we use? Represent. There were many attempts during the COVID to do this. As yet another role of mine, I teach. I have to explain literature to young people. And then young people have to explain literature to me. And one of my favorite questions is, where do you think is that семечко, seed from which this text was born? We do know that Anna Karenina was born from a failure, which is a grand lesson, as at least in my philosophy of life. Most great things are born of failures. So Anna Karenina is born of failure of Tolstoy to write a novel about Peter I. And when philologists compare how Tolstoy describes the face of Peter to a description of face of Anna Karenina, actually some of the same words are used, which gives me endless pleasure, because the sexiest, the coolest woman of Russian literature is Peter I. So, with everything that this might imply. Living pictures began kind of congealing when I worked among the archives. I worked in the Hermitage, which has its own archive, as you can imagine. And at some point, I was privy to a conversation that during the siege, Hermitage didn't have electricity. Hermitage had tiny bit of electricity. The only room in Hermitage actually with light was the office of Arbeli, its director, who was one of 9 witnesses at Nuremberg process. You can watch his speech. It's extremely interesting. He's lying like there is no tomorrow. He was one of the most interesting people to me of the Leningrad century. He saved Hermitage just by daring to say that maybe we should begin sending these materials to the East. So in order to give electricity to Arbeli, a military ship that was situated at the Neva was sending electricity that way. And in connection to this arrangement, sailors would come to the Hermitage, and then sailors who were fed much better than the civilians saw what was happening with the civilians. They understood that they have to feed them. And they began bringing things like, I don't know, pasta in their pockets and feeding the curators of the Hermitage. And proud curators of the Hermitage, смотрительницы, decided that they should thank the sailors and they should give them guided tours of the empty frames. So at that moment, when I attempted to imagine how this хранительница, which is a great word in Russian, would try to impersonate the, I don't know, the prodigal son by Rembrandt. How do you actually explain that? The book just began happening. Also, Living Pictures is my first book of prose. Now, just to describe me as a biological species, I'm one of those unpleasant children who begin writing at the age of 8. There is, like, this is the situation. I've been writing poetry since age of 8. They began publishing me when I was 9. So I'm in the profession for time long enough, believe me. And first, I don't know, 30 years, I never thought about writing prose. But I guess studying Siege just did something, though I do remember that for years I thought I would never write poetry about this. This is not my material, this is not my language, there must be some separation. But then I guess once you say this, I never will do something, it basically means that you will do it. Speaking of Anna Karenina, right? That. And I remember that the first text I wrote about it was this cycle about the siege poets, because I was just so bubbling with this, not just knowledge, but feelings about them. I was so unbearably in love with them, with these writers and poets whom I encountered. So I guess, and again, we had with different publishers. This book has a curious life now in various languages. We had to describe what this book is about, right? Endless blurbs for festivals and whatnot. This book is about a young woman, then not very young woman, who is studying the Siege of Leningrad almost in spite of her will, going deeper and deeper into all the contradictions of this. For example, one of the contradictions that I just gave you, that you think that you're doing historical neutral research, and then you understand that there is nothing neutral about it, that it's a question of passions, that you constantly end up offending somebody, that you're going to a hopefully predictable situation, and somebody will get up and ask you, tell us whether your grandfather and grandmother, were they in the siege? And you tell them no. And then there is silence. Like, you're an enemy, you're a traitor, you're the чужой. But again, for years I had to explain that it is because you are чужой you can write about it. And let's also discuss кто чужой. So this is what the book is about. It has many, many characters, many poets and writers, some totally not poets and not writers. And to my endless embarrassment and surprise, I wrote a play, which is called Tableau Vivant. It gives the name to the volume. And then I saw the play on the stage. And it's a tiny play. Again, somehow I like all things diminutive when I speak about this. Книжица, пьеска. It's a small, brief play for 3 characters, смотрительница and 2 lovers, and she art critic and he is an artist, and they lived during the siege in the Hermitage, as dozens and dozens of people did. Arbeeli came up with this idea. And they were putting those who died in one room, and by February there were significant numbers, and the living were in the other side of this. And by the way, speaking of cuteness, now this space where they lived, it's known as the space for the cats of the Hermitage, which I also find to be rather interesting, because when they choose to talk to me about this, and again, it's not that I really, really enjoy being unpleasant, though I do enjoy being unpleasant. I do enjoy and choose being unpleasant when I feel that there is falsch, which today is not just falsch, but falsch funded with multi-million budgets. But if you want to talk to me about cats, let's talk about cats. I'm ready. Actually, and this is maybe one subject in my writing which I touched only slightly, because somehow I find to be really hurtful and hurting. There were no cats in the city, they ate them. And when you read their diaries, this is the moment when ostensibly something breaks. The moment when the intelligentsia family of Leningrad would eat their cat, it was the beginning of the end very often. And so the attempt of the new Hermitage and an incredibly curious person, Mikhail Piotrovsky, one of the leaders of Putin's cultural campaign now, when they attempt to turn бомбоубежище and morgue of Hermitage into the space of the cute cats, problems and legends and ghosts, they procreate. Ghosts create more ghosts. So maybe we should think about the ghosts of the siege cats. And this is the book about that, about procreating ghosts. Some of the characters, again, it was interesting for me that Americans and Germans, and now even there is translation into New Greek, which I find to be endlessly pleasing, because I studied the old Greek, so to say, for 5 years, 10 hours a day. Я классик по образованию. It's interesting that this became translatable, because I thought that this is a purely Petersburg, Leningrad story. It's filled with the characters whose names say a lot to people in the city, less so, I thought, to the people outside. Translators in different volumes chose to comment this differently. The question of apparatus is interesting. My French translator comments everything, not in the endnotes, but in footnotes. It's a kind of Borgesian approach. There is lots of conversations and meetings and, I don't know, encounters and dates with Harms. Harms is very important for my writing, always. Yeah.
So we're getting to the time where we have to have a Q&A, but I promised to ask you about your future creative plans, beginning with a kind of a quick mention of the text that you'll be presenting in Russian on Saturday, and then what comes next? More siege work, more historical work?
Yeah, so my new book about Petersburg has come out in Russian. It's about Petersburg in 1718. I will be speaking about it on Saturday. I'm rather stuck on this city. And yesterday, when I was sitting in the square outside, I was looking at the sky, thinking kind of, is it white night? Is it not? Is it whitish night? All that. But it looks like I'm beginning next phase of my research, which was, again, the seed, of course, comes from the siege, but it goes much further in perhaps new areas of distress for me and for my audience, for my polite audience. At some point I began interested and involved in the question how the Siege of Leningrad was described by Nazi propaganda, especially by so-called поднемецкая русская пресса, by how Russian-speaking journalists and writers who were publishing in the Nazi newspapers were writing about the siege. And it turns to be the project I'm working on now about the second wave of Russian immigration, people who left Soviet Union in 1944, 1945, and their literary lives, which are rarely touched. Like, to touch them in Russia now, it's a дело. In general, at the moment studying the World War II in Russia now, it is even difficult to pronounce this. It sounds so surreal and absurd, but it's very easy to end up in prison for this. But to talk about the siege in this context, it's problematic. But for me, once you begin thinking about these things, you continue. This is what I think I will be doing next 15 years.
That's a long time. So now we open it up for questions from the audience. And we'll pass the mic to you if you have a question.
Has anybody got a question?
Thank you very much. You mentioned you don't like the word survivors. Can you explain why and what other word you use to describe people who lived through or maybe not lived through the siege?
Survivor. No, it's simple, but also not. And when in this kind of profession, in this kind of business of history research, of history readers, you say that you work with the testimonials of survivors, then what Primo Levi said becomes rather poignant. And Primo Levi said that only those who didn't survive knew what happened. Actually, what I meant, tangentially, when this book came out, вот эта книжечка, you know, I think my whole thing with diminutives, when I was 19, I studied diminutives in Catullus, and I think it somehow influenced me deeply. You know, the whole thing about libellum. When this book, Libellum, came out, granddaughter of one of this poet and remarkable creature, Pavel Zaltzman, a poet, a diarist, and an amazing artist. What you see on the cover is his work. The first in his endless cycle of ruins, which with every decade were becoming more and more abstract and dreamlike. So Zaltzman's granddaughter, Masha, in this kind of Q&A situation, just stands up and says, do you understand that, so these texts survived? Do you ever think about how much of this text didn't? Kind of antithetical to, you know, Bulgakovian motto. Может быть, рукописи не горят, но, видит Бог, они замерзают. So, and it was such an important moment because I felt great at that presentation. I still kind of feel great about this book. I love it. Then suddenly, it's okay. But I think it is also important to combine this pride, and not just pride, awe, my favorite American word, A-W-E, with the total pain of understanding and sobriety of understanding that most of these texts, London is the city of many sounds, I have to tell you, that most of these texts disappeared. We'll never read poetries of some of the most striking inhabitants of that situation. And when I say this, when they disappeared variously. Many texts disappeared after the suppression, by which I mean massacre, of the Siege Museum in 1946. The Siege Museum led by an incredible figure, Lev Rakov. And again, as 1946, a memorable date for Leningrad, постановление of Zhdanov, and in connection to the Leningrad affair, it had all kinds of consequences. People were murdered for being bad Leningraders during the siege. And the museum was murdered. And from 1943 till this moment, Leningraders really attempted to collect body of evidence, of which many documents were burned, and many documents we assume were relocated to the KGB building not far from there. So this is only one example. But also, of course, I mean how many of these texts disappeared during the siege itself. We know of some of these texts that disappeared. So this is maybe a somewhat tangential way to answer your question. What do I mean when I say surviving and non-surviving, выжившие и исчезнувшие? I want to continue to feel that what we have, and also this work only was at its very inception. Several years ago, a remarkable book received Pushkin Prize of colleague and friend of mine, Alexis Perry, called The War Within. She just read diaries. And the whole story about diaries of the siege is incredible because, again, in comparison to the camps, German and Soviet, for example, there are all levels of what's different with the siege. For example, they were at home, which means they were reading, which means they were rereading. So this whole thing about Dickens, for example, other people whom they were rereading aggressively. As I found out, who are the favorite Leningrad writers? Proust, Poe, and, to my endless tenderness, more understandably than Proust and Poe, perhaps Dumas. They're all reading Dumas and writing about it in their diaries. But we have, this work was begun in 2000s. Conferences happened, some books were published, but now nothing of this is possible in Russia. Again, Memorial, we worked with them, was crushed and relocated, and so on and so on. And this strange Atlantis, excuse me, I'm not sure I like this metaphor even. It kind of went up and then went down again. And we see these strange glimmering figures.
Actually, you answered half of my question in the course of your talk when you were saying, well, yeah, чужой, and that's why I can write about it. But still, I'm interested to find out more about the kind of mindset when you're writing poems about the siege or in the siege. Who are you when you're writing that? Because they sound like some of the poems I've read that were actually written by people, but then they're not. Like, who are you? What space are you inhabiting when you're writing about the siege? Thank you.
It's a very difficult question, but I have to say that with years I kind of trained myself to, first of all, since I'm in the business of being these meetings with past or future readers or present readers, I decided that I will attempt to take questions seriously. And some of the most unpleasant questions became the most useful. The questions that at first I did everything, like physically, to resist them. And then I thought, what if I tried to actually open myself to a question? That happened in Petersburg several times. So with years, I understood that one of the people who was extremely important for me, you know this name, many of you know this name, It's Evgeny Schwartz, whom many of you know as a playwright. An incredibly curious playwright. But somehow my affair with Schwartz would be very surprised to hear that sentence, being, I guess, the only genius of the Soviet century who was in love with his wife his whole life. Who, after Schwartz died at the ripe age of 61 or something, his wife committed suicide. I became absolutely taken by his prose. There were two prose writers of, I think, world scale who came out of the siege. And these are Lydia Ginsburg and Evgeny Schwartz. And I'm happy to talk about this endlessly, which might present a problem. But one of Schwartz's kinds of writing, at the end of his life, he writes this extremely weird in terms of genre body of prose, which we can call an anti-novel. How does it help us exactly? He writes so-called phone books, which I think is a rather theatrical affair. He gives himself like a task: write about Shostakovich, write about Kozintsev, write about Akimov. And then he comes to somebody about whom we really would like to read something written by Schwartz. He comes to Bergholz, and then he says, I know her too well. I won't write about her. And you think, hell. Like, But one thing that I learned from him, for example, a part of this text is what was published by Lev Lossev under the title Белый Волк, White Wolf. It's his text about Chukovsky, whose secretary Schwartz was once. He writes about people who, many of whom are dead for him, as if they were alive. Which means he writes fiercely. Absolutely, all these things about о мертвых либо хорошо, либо ничего. I don't remember this in Latin. This is Latin. I'm tired. But in English, you don't say nasty things about dead. He doesn't go there because he doesn't want them to be dead. He wants them to be alive. I wanted so badly these people to be alive. So many people were offended by my poem about Bergholz that I read to you. Now, when Bergholz's diary is published, you can read it. There are portions in English. It's this big. It's an amazing diary. I think, again, I am slightly subjective, maybe, not very objective. But I think if there would be one diary to read to understand the complexity of the Soviet psyche, I would volunteer Olga Fedorovna. Because like in the clinical language, yes, one would call it rather schizophrenic situation. She fully acknowledges certain peculiarities of the totalitarian situation with tortures. She was tortured, as you saw from the poem. And simultaneously, she is absolutely in love with the whole thing. And she receives the role of the official siege poet happily. And of course, the fate would have it so that Akhmatova was not able to be in the city. As you know, she she didn't choose. She had to leave. Akhmatova was very, very sick. She had a mental breakdown. Bergholz chose to stay in the city. Of course, she didn't know in October what November would bring. But anyway, she was offered to accompany Akhmatova to Tashkent. I guess just this desire and stubbornness that I want them to be. I wanted to be able to read these awful poems by Gore to people. Awful, but also astounding, because they are so beautifully made in their ugliness. And all these endless quotes from every poet you can think of, and all that. At some point, when the English language version of the Living Pictures was made, we played with the idea of naming the English version The Winter Lovers, for a number of reasons, because it's Winter Palace, because it's winter of 1941. I think when I wrote poems and prose about them, it was just of very peculiarly understood feeling of love, which very often to many people looks and feels like, I don't know, hatred, disgust, and estrangement. For me, it's love.
Thank you for this talk. You mentioned earlier that you said you would never write poetry about this topic, but you did choose to express yourself through prose. So I just wanted to ask about how these forms differ for you. How do you see them, poetry from prose? How do you express yourself in either?
So many ways to answer this direct and nevertheless wonderful and sly question. I'm not the first one among the Russian poets. I'm not the first one among the non-Russian poets. It might be something about age. See, I don't know, there is such a thing as biology of creativity. Something that we don't know much about. Why Khodasevich stops writing? Why Sayat Nova, the color of pomegranate, stops writing? Why Akhmatova, Mandelstam, and Pasternak do not write for 5 years and then continue? We don't know. Why poets begin writing prose? We don't know. We can speculate. Again, something happened when Siege entered my world. Poetry somehow became not being enough to talk about them. But also, since I'm writing prose, now I wrote this silly book which made me very happy while I was writing it, which I call a book about caterpillars. It's about art in Petersburg in 1718 and caterpillars. It's just also so much fun when you are me, when I'm me, and somebody asks you with this kind of compassion and curiosity and pathos, what are you working on? And you say, I'm working on the book of caterpillars. And then there is this tremendous awkward silence, and they think that maybe you lost your mind, and you're just like, now I'm done with the book with caterpillars, we'll see what's next. writing prose gives you completely different experience of how you deal with time and temporality. I find it to be tremendously interesting. Then, of course, everybody who reads me says, approvingly, disapprovingly, begrudgingly, well, this is prose of a poet. Let me tell you. I don't know why. Scholars will come. Scholars are coming. The best prose in Russian is written by poets now. I absolutely promise you that. There are Goralik, Stepanova, Petrova, all women. It's curious what's happening. I don't know. History will say.
I think, yeah, we've got time for one more question.
You didn't mention anything about music that was written during the Siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg.
Okay, this is where I will leave myself in this role. I won't leave you, I will just met you. I have a side project. And again, it's absolutely pathetic. It's not right. But what is right in the world now? There are, as you know, there are conferences, institutes dedicated, she said jealously, to the study of Holocaust. There were like 6 of us studying the Siege of Leningrad. So we kind of divided. And I got culture, which is many muses, right? It's like a collective of muses. I am peculiarly devoid of musical hearing, which was an interesting situation among my friends, and because like I'm surrounded by people who go to listen to Bach with a note paper. They read and they are upset if something is misrepresented. This is like I'm surrounded by aliens. My relationship with Shostakovich is extremely intense, but mostly because Shostakovich is one of the funniest writers I have encountered. You want to have good bedtime reading, read Shostakovich's letters. When he was writing North, he is writing letters which are syntonically consist of sometimes obscenely, always extremely wittily montaged Gogol. So for me, Shostakovich is a literary figure rather than a musical one. I do understand fully that this is pathetic. But Shostakovich was taken out of the city in September. The person who wrote the musical text about the siege, which made siege the event of the world history, knew nothing about the siege. The world doesn't know names of many, many composers and musicians who stayed in the siege. This research was made partially. There is a great book by Andrei Kryukov on this. My research touches this because I'm putting together a volume with a team. It's often with a team because it takes a village, it takes a city. About the postcards published during the Siege of Leningrad. If you try to guess how many postcards were published during the Siege of Leningrad, thousands. Which gives you some idea about incredible importance that this kind of regime gives to how the image of its history is represented. Right? Because postcards take not only many people who work on it, but lots of materials in the city that has certain shortage of materials. So among these postcards, there were postcards songs, which had notes and text. There were many songs about the siege written during the siege. So it's a very interesting topic. And there's another part of it that there was theater and musical theater. The third poem of the cycle, from which I began reading to you, is about a person who wrote in 1942 vaudeville, musical about the siege. You don't come up with this shit. When you begin telling about this to people, you just read it. It's there. It's when I began doing all this, and when I began talking to people about all this, one of the most popular questions was, where do you find this? Like, you're such a hero. Where, like, you find it everywhere. Every archive in that city, at least used to have. I have no idea what is happening today. I haven't been in the city for 6 years. But when I was working on it, siege material was everywhere, in the open site. With, again, I don't know, 6 scholars trying to work on it. The results are seen very well today of this story not being made more popular during last 50 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paulina, and thank you, Susan, for joining us as well tonight. We've got plenty of copies of Paulina's books downstairs, Living Pictures, Air Raid, Written in the Dark, as well as the originals in Russian. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Liana, who's going to say a couple of words about Paulina's event on Saturday. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Polina. Thank you, Susan, for this wonderful talk. And I'd like to announce that we have another event this Saturday afternoon, which is going to happen at 2 o'clock. And Polina will present her new prose book that has been already mentioned, just published in Russian just recently. And this event will be entirely conducted in Russian. So it's a book that's called «Сибилы» или «Книга о чудесных превращениях», «The Sibyls», or the book of wondrous transformations. And this book about metamorphosis, transformations, about lost art, St. Petersburg. So there's a lot of topics. It's very interesting. And Polina will also read of her poetry. So please come, join us. We'll be pleased to see you Saturday afternoon. Yeah.